All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is Chapter 3, Creating Anglo-America. In this chapter, we're going to be looking at the expansion of England's empire, the global competition, origins of American slavery, the colonies in crisis, the growth of colonial America, and the development of social classes in the colonies. First slide, we have the painting, The Residence of Donald Twining. This is a painting kind of show you the typical Anglo, which means white in English, American colony, the farm. Okay, so for our first section, remember with our focus questions, we are taking notes in this section that will help answer this question. We're looking at how did the English Empire in America expand in the mid-17th century. So we're going to look at the mercantilist system. By the mid-1600s, it was apparent to England's rulers that their North American colonies would be something that could generate them tremendous amount of wealth. So they moved to seize control of Atlantic trade. They wanted to consolidate their hold over the continent's eastern coast and greater regulate its empire. England acted according to the theory of mercantilism. This is an idea in which the government regulates the economic activity in order to promote national power by encouraging manufacturing and business through special bounties, monopolies, and other measures. Primarily, this is to manipulate trade so that more gold and silver entered the country than leaves it. So the idea with this, again, mercantile system, is that the government will regulate as much of the economy as possible to make sure that more is coming in than is going out. As far as goods and services, especially gold and silver, the export of goods, which generated revenue from abroad, should exceed the imports, which requires paying the foreigners for their products. The colony's role was to serve the interests of the mother country by producing the raw materials and importing manufactured goods from England. The Navigation Acts of 1651, something we mentioned in Chapter 2, were intended in order to get greater control over the world trade from the Dutch. What they required is that valuable goods produced in the colonies, such as tobacco and sugar, first had to be shipped to and traded in English ships and ports, and that most European goods shipped to the colonies had to be shipped through England. What this is, it enabled the government to collect taxes and allowed the English merchants, manufacturers, shipbuilders, and sailors to benefit from the trade. American colonist ships were considered English, and in New England, the Acts stimulated its considerable shipbuilding industry. Now, with the restoration of the English monarchy in 1660 under Charles II, England had expanded its colonial reach. It chartered new trading ventures, such as the Royal African Company, which was given a monopoly on the slave trade, and it soon doubled the number of English colonies in North America. The English seized New Netherland in 1664 as part of an Anglo-Dutch war that had resulted in the conquest of Dutch trading posts in Africa. England transformed this minor military post of New Netherlands into an important imperial seaport and a military base for operations against the French. English rule over New York had expanded and also limited the freedom for certain groups. The English promised to continue religious toleration and respect property holdings, but they also eliminated some rights for married women and practices that had benefited female colonists. The English had also discriminated against free blacks who had previously enjoyed all of the rights of other free men. English rule also, for a time, strengthened the Iroquois Confederacy in upstate New York. In the mid-1670s, New York's Governor Sir Edmund Andros had formed an alliance with the Iroquois known as the Covenant Treaty. What this is, it expanded the English and Iroquois power in the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley regions. They did this, though, at the expense of the French and their Indian allies. At the same time, many English colonists began to complain that they were being denied their English liberties, particularly the right to consent to taxation. The Dutch in New Netherland had not had any kind of representative assembly, and English rule began without one as well. In 1683, the Duke of York agreed to an elected assembly, which then drafted the Charter of Liberties and Privileges affirming their traditional English religious political rights. Here you see the map. This is also on page 96 of your textbook of Eastern North America in the 17th and early 18th centuries. You can see that by the early 18th century, there were very numerous English colonies that populated the Eastern North America, while the French had established their own presence more to the north and to the west. Here's an early 18th century engraving that depicts William Penn welcoming a German immigrant on the dock in Philadelphia. Penn, remember, was really looking to make migrants from all over Europe feel at home in Pennsylvania and to be considered as equals. Penn envisioned his colony as really kind of this holy experiment that was to be governed on Quaker principles, including the equality of all people. This included women, blacks, and Indians under God in the primacy of the individual conscience. That was primary. Penn and the colony's Quakers treated the Indians with special consideration, trying to make peace with them. Quakers are pacifists, did not have militias, and they took a lot of effort to pay all Indian land claims. Above everything, Penn emphasized religious freedom. And this was ensured in 1682 in the colony's Charter of Liberty. Penn formed an assembly elected by male taxpayers and freemen, either free immigrants with 100 acres of land or former indentured servants with 50 acres. This gave the vote to a majority of the colony's men. Penn also owned all of the land and sold it to settlers at low prices to encourage more of a broad distribution of landed wealth and social equality. Pennsylvania's freedom attracted a lot of migrants from all over Europe, and this made the colony prosperous, but it also increased tensions with the Indians, as whites who were not Quakers and pacifists pushed into Indian territory. It also fostered the growth of African slavery in the southern colonies as more indentured servants chose to migrate to Pennsylvania rather than Virginia or Maryland, so the southern colonies need to find their labor elsewhere. You can see in this picture, this is a Quaker meeting painted by an unidentified British artist dating from the late 18th century or early 19th century. It's really showing us kind of the prominent place of women in Quaker gatherings. You can see that women, while still somewhat separate from the men, they're not intermingled, are not at a lower level. In this next section, we're going to focus on how slavery was established in the Western Atlantic world, the origins of American slavery. Now, while the English, like other European colonists in the Americas, didn't intend to rely on African slaves as a labor force, the growing demand for labor for tobacco in the Chesapeake region led planters there to turn to the transatlantic slave trade. White masters saw a lot of advantages in using African slaves rather than white indentured servants. African slaves were not protected by English common law. Their terms never expired. They did not become discontented, landless men that once finished with their term became a burden to society, like many former servants had. And their children were slaves. Their skin color made it more difficult for them to escape, in the sense that they couldn't just blend into society. And they were accustomed to difficult agricultural work. Also, many compared to Native American slaves, African slaves were already immune from many European diseases. While the English did not have modern notions of race, in which humankind is divided into groups associated with skin color, or racism as an ideology based that, races are inherently superior to others or entitled to rule over them, English did view other peoples, such as the Irish, Native Americans, and Africans, as uncivilized, pagan, savage, and animal-like. At the time, the English, like other Europeans, tended to divide humanity in between those who are either civilized or are barbaric. So really Christian or non-Christian. One of those two categories is either barbaric, or they're civilized, or they're Christian, or they're non-Christian. Yet Africans, because of their skin color, religion, and social practices, were seen by the English as enslavable, in a way that maybe the poor English were not. Slavery had existed for almost all of human history. This is not a new practice. It was central to ancient Greece, Rome, and it survived in northern Europe among the Germans, Vikings, and Anglo-Saxons after the Roman Empire's collapse. And although slavery existed in the 1600s in the Mediterranean and Africa, it was quite different from plantation form of slavery that developed in the Americas, in which large numbers of slaves are being brought together for very demanding agricultural labor under a single owner. The large numbers of slaves increased the dangers of slave rebellion, also invited harsh discipline. And unlike in Africa, the death rate was higher, and African slaves who became free still had a skin color that whites associated with slavery, thus marked them as unworthy of equality in a free society. This picture is called Cutting Sugar Cane. It's an engraving from 10 Views in Antigua. This was published in 1823. You can see in here male and female slaves harvest and load the sugar crop while an overseer on horseback talking to a slave. During the 18th century, sugar was the chief crop produced in the Western Hemisphere by Western Hemisphere slaves. The African slave trade became a major international and transatlantic business only in the 1600s. Slavery had developed first in the Western Hemisphere outside of North America. By 1600, Brazil, which is a Portuguese colony, had large sugar plantations that were worked by African slaves. By the end of the 17th century, the profits to be had from sugar had transformed English, Dutch, French, and Danish colonies in the West Indies from mixed economies with a few slaves and small farms that were worked by white servants to now those dominated by lucrative sugar plantations worked exclusively by African slaves. Sugar was the first good to be mass marketed to European consumers and became the most important product that the British, French, and Portuguese empires had. Compared to its rapid introduction in Brazil and the West Indies, slavery grew slowly in North America. English indentured servants constituted the majority of the labor force in the Chesapeake well into the 1680s, and the most significant division in this region in the 17th century was not between whites and blacks, but between white plantation owners, who were dominant in politics and society, and everyone else, the small farmers, servants, and slaves. While Spain had some more liberal laws that granted slaves various rights, and the Catholic Church often encouraged masters to free their slaves, the legal status of slaves in the English colonies was initially kind of ambiguous and undeveloped. Beginning in 1619, there was a small numbers of Africans were brought to the Chesapeake, and while they were almost certainly treated as slaves, some were freed after serving a term of years. Racial distinctions were codified into law from the beginning. One such early Virginia law barred blacks from serving in the militia. But both in Maryland and Virginia, free blacks could sue, testify in court, and even some even acquired land and purchased white servants and black slaves. Blacks and whites worked side by side in the region's tobacco fields and occasionally ran away together and established family-type relations. Though evidence shows us that slaves were being held for life as early as the 1640s, only in the 1660s did Virginia and Maryland laws refer explicitly to slavery. As tobacco planting spread and labor demand increased, conditions that faced blacks and white servants started to kind of split or change. In order to encourage migration, colonial authorities tried to improve the status of white servants. At the same time, blacks' opportunities for freedom were restricted. By 1680, ideas of racial difference were strongly reflected in these colonies' laws, despite their small black population. New laws, for example, mandated that the children of free and slave parents would have the legal status of the mother. This ensured that masters could profit from possibly having children with female slaves, since the child would then become the master's property. The shift from white indentured servants to African slaves was the main plantation workforce was hurried or quickened in 1676 by Bacon's rebellion. Now, at this time, the governor, William Berkeley, had long ruled Virginia through a very corrupt regime. He forged an alliance with a small elite of the colony's wealthiest tobacco planters and gave his supporters the best lands as white settlement pushed inland. With all of the best lands already taken by the wealthy planters, there was an increasingly poor population of freed white servants and migrants who were finding it much harder to acquire land. They were being forced to settle in frontier areas, and these men were also disenfranchised or kept from voting by new law that limited the vote. Once it was given to all adult men, now only to landowners. And so in 1676, disgruntled frontier whites demanded that Berkeley exterminate or expel frontier Indians in order to make room for white settlers. But the governor, fearing war and profiting from the Indian trade, refused. So led by Nathaniel Bacon, small farmers, landless men, indentured servants, and even some Africans who had also demanded lower taxes and an end to elite rule, began to wage war against the Indians and the colonial government. They plundered plantations, burned Jamestown to the ground, until the English warships helped to stop the rebellion. Virginia's ruling elite consolidated their rule by both limiting democracy and expanding social opportunity for poor whites. So they are reinforcing property qualifications for voting, also reduced taxes, and adopted some more aggressive policies toward Indians to open up more western lands. Most important, tobacco planters more and more spurned potentially rebellious white servants for African slaves. So they're no longer relying on the white servants, instead on African slaves. And this is making Chesapeake region a society that is now based on slavery. In this picture, we see a scene that is depicted on an English handkerchief of a male and female slaves working in the tobacco field. In this picture, however, you notice they are working right alongside this white indentured servant that is on the right. This is Sir William Berkeley, governor of colonial Virginia, 1641 to 1652, and also again in 1660 to 1677. Remember, his very strong and handed authoritarian rule is part of what helped spark Bacon's rebellion. Now, between 1700 and 1750, blacks went from more than 10% to almost 50% of the colony's population. Almost were all slaves. Several factors contributed to the growth of slavery in Virginia. So we're talking about Virginia, keep that in mind. In 1705, Virginia's legislature adopted a new slave code that embedded this idea of white supremacy into law, clearly defined black slaves as property, and sharply limited the freedom of both free and enslaved blacks. Virginia had shifted from being a society with slaves, in which slavery was just part of the labor system, among other systems, to a slave society. So now they are a society in which slavery is central to the society and economy. Europeans, Indians, and Africans alike all feared enslavement. Slaves often tried to escape, and those who spoke or read English or were familiar with European culture sometimes contested their conditions. Slaves continued to resist their masters even as legal avenues for freedom receded in the Chesapeake at the end of the 17th and beginning of the 18th century. Now we're looking at, in this next section, what major social and political crises begin to rock the colonies in the late 17th century. Upheaval in England had also affected the colonies. In 1688, the struggle for control over the English government between Parliament and the Crown culminated in the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution was a bloodless, meaning there was no fighting, no death, event that finally established parliamentary supremacy and a Protestant succession to the throne. Under Charles II's rule, Parliament had expanded its authority and its powers, but his unpopular successor, James II, had really alienated much of England after claiming to rule by divine right. And he was seeking religious toleration for Protestant dissenters and Catholics. Fearing that the throne would go to his Catholic son, English aristocrats invited William of Orange, a Dutch nobleman and husband to Mary, James II's Protestant daughter, to assume the throne in the name of English liberties. In 1688, James II fled before William's invading army, and William and Mary took the throne. The Parliament soon enacted a Bill of Rights, giving the Parliament control over taxation and establishing individual rights like trial by jury. This peaceful coup assured that England's balanced constitutional monarchy, which allowed English subjects at home and in the colonies to celebrate English Protestantism and the rights and properties. Now, before the Glorious Revolution, England's rulers sought to reduce colonial autonomy within the empire. Charles II had revoked Massachusetts' colonial charter for violations of the Navigation Act, which the Massachusetts legislature had earlier refused to recognize because the colony, they said, had no direct representation in Parliament. And by 1688, James II had combined the colonies of Connecticut, Plymouth, and Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, in East and West Jersey, which is Pennsylvania, into one single super colony, the Dominion of New England. This was going to be ruled by New York's former governor, Sir Edmund Andros, who was unaccountable to any legislature. The actions of King James and Andros alienated many, many colonists. Here's our picture of King William III. This is a portrait that was painted around 1697 by an unknown artist. Remember, William came to power in England as a result of the Glorious Revolution. Now, news of King James' oust in 1689 caused rebellions in several American colonies. Boston militia jailed Andros and other imperial officials, and the New England colonies reestablished their government. In New York, rebels led by Jacob Leisler took control, and soon after, Protestant rebels in Maryland overthrew the government of that colony's Catholic proprietor, Lord Baltimore. They successfully revoked the old charter and created a new Protestant-dominated government. Leisler's rebellion was not as successful. Leisler's government unintentionally divided the colony along ethnic and economic lines, which caused strife between the majority, who were Dutch, and the minority, who were English, and also between poor rebels and the wealthy. Soon, the alienated Dutch merchants and prominent English colonists united against him and convinced King William to suppress Leisler, who was executed in his regime as well. The rebellion and its suppression polarized New York politics for decades. With the removal of Andros and the dissolution of the Dominion of New England, the English crown restored most of the colony's old charters. However, Massachusetts received a new charter as a royal colony, which now incorporated Plymouth. The new charter made property ownership, not church membership, to be the qualification for voting in elections for the colony's legislature, made the governor a crown appointee, and required religious toleration of all Protestant denominations. These measures ended the Puritans' Bible Commonwealth, which empowered giving non-Puritan merchants and large landowners an increasing anxiety among Puritans who were ever alert to the devil's work. Now, many Puritans, like other Europeans and colonial Americans by the 17th century, believed in magic, astrology, witchcraft, and other supernatural phenomena, and often interpreted natural events as having a religious or otherworldly meaning. Witchcraft in the colony was punishable by hanging in Europe and in the colony and in Europe, both. In the colonies, occasionally individuals convicted of witchcraft had been hanged. Most accused of witchcraft were women beyond childbearing age, so we were older women who are very outspoken, who are economically independent, who might be separated from their husbands or otherwise thought in some way to violate some kind of gender norms. A witch's powers were held to challenge God's will and the stature of men as family heads and rules of society. In 1691 in Salem, Massachusetts, initial accusations of witchcraft snowballed into a full-blown crisis, as more and more of the accused tried to save themselves by confessing and naming others as witches. The frenzy of accusations led to legal charges against nearly 150 people. Most of them were women, 19 men, and women were hanged. Massachusetts religious and civil authorities were appalled. They dissolved the Salem courts and warned that the courts would no longer accept testimony from those claiming to be possessed or accept the confessions and accusations of those facing execution. The Salem witchcraft case discredited the prosecution of witches and encouraged a greater interest among prominent colonists in finding scientific explanation for natural events. Now, in this next section, we're going to be looking at the directions of social and economic change in the 18th century colony. Although we see the Spanish and French empires remaining particularly powerful in the Americas even into the 18th century, England's mainland colonies in North America soon exceeded those of the French and Spain in trade and population. They've grown from 265,000 in 1700 to over 2.3 million in 1770. Colonial American society in the 18th century was very diverse. The number of African and non-English European arrivals greatly increased, while the number of English migrants declined. Nearly 40% of those emigrating to English colonies did so as unfree indentured servants. An increasing number of migrants were professionals and skilled craftsmen, causing the English government to stop promoting migration to North America. They did not want their skilled people leaving for the colonies. They wanted them to stay in England. And while English authorities worried that the colonies might drain England of these skilled workers and professionals, they sent thousands of convicts to work in the Chesapeake tobacco fields and still promoted Protestant migration from non-English areas of the British Isles and Europe. Many thousands came from Scotland and Northern Ireland, where many Scots, the Scot-Irish, had settled as part of England's colonization effort. You can see on this chart shows the origins and status of a lot of the people coming to the British North American colonies in 1700 to 1775. In this map, we see the European settlement and ethnic diversity on the Atlantic coast of North America in 1760. You can see the different shades of color represent different places of origin. Now, more than 100,000 Germans who came to America, they were the largest group of European migrants during this period. Many were members of the Catholic Church or a small dissenting Protestant sect fleeing from persecution, while others migrated to escape worsening economic conditions. They tended to settle in frontier areas of New York and Pennsylvania and in the southern colonies. Germans migrated as families, often as redemptioneer families of indentured servants who were working to pay back the cost of passage to America. While ethnic groups tended to live and worship in relatively homogeneous communities apart from one another, the American colonies, except for New England, were far more diverse than England. This was especially evident in the religious makeup of British America. In 1700, the colony's churches were almost entirely congregational and Anglican. But despite the colony's commitment to official churches everywhere except New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Pennsylvania, de facto religious toleration increasingly defined religious life. Especially with the Great Awakening of the 1740s, sects such as Lutherans, Mennonites, Anabaptists, Moravians, Seventh-day Baptists, and Presbyterians, and even Jews and Muslims were increasingly free to worship as they pleased, even if they were still taxed to support the official church and banned from holding public office. Baptists were among the numerous religious denominations in the 18th century colonies. In this engraving we see, this is from a History of American Baptists published in 1770, we see a minister baptizing new members in the river in Pennsylvania, while other members of the congregation look on. Newcomers to America who equated freedom with secure land ownership threatened surviving Indian populations. By the 1700s, Indian communities had changed dramatically from the time of the Europeans' arrival and were very much a part of the British Empire. They were trading, using European goods, allying with the Europeans, and were fighting for British in successive imperial wars against the French and Spanish. New settlers pressured colonial governments to open up the frontier lands at the expense of Indian tribes. In Pennsylvania, mostly peaceful relations between the Quaker-dominated government and Indians disintegrated as new migrants often fraudulently made purchases or attacked natives for their lands. By the mid-18th century, different regions of British colonies had developed distinct economic and social orders. New England and frontier settlements and other colonies were characterized by families laboring on small farms, producing for local consumption. The frontier backcountry areas rapidly grew in population. In the older middle colonies of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, more farmers produced for commercial markets and used non-family wage or slave labor. You can see in this picture, this is William Penn's treaty with the Indians. Penn's grandson, Thomas, who was the proprietor of Pennsylvania, commissioned this painting in 1771. This was by Benjamin West. By this time, harmony between the Indians and the colonists had become much more hostile. And so in the 19th century, many reproductions of this image circulated, and this reminded Americans that Indians had once been central figures in their history. In the 1700s, Great Britain became the leading producer and trader of inexpensive consumer goods, including colonial goods such as coffee and tea, and manufactured goods like linen, metalware, glassware, ceramics, and clothing. Trade brought together the British Empire, and the American colonies shared in this consumer revolution. Even modest farmers and artisans bought items like books, ceramic plates, metal cutlery, and tea, and these were once considered luxury goods, now affordable to more common people. Britain's mainland colonies were almost entirely rural in agriculture, and only a very small percentage of the population lived in the port cities of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. In 1770, Philadelphia's 30,000 inhabitants made it the largest city in British North America. These cities were centers of trade and exchange and were inhabited by growing numbers of merchants, skilled craftsmen, and the poor. The urban artisan population included furniture makers, jewelers, silversmiths serving wealthier citizens, and lesser artisans such as weavers, blacksmiths, and construction workers. The typical master artisan owned his own tools, worked in a small workshop, often his home, and was assisted by family members and young journeymen and apprentices who were learning the trade. The artisan survived by his skill, which gave him economic independence and freedom compared to unskilled laborers. Most craftsmen had a reasonable chance of becoming a master in their lifetime. This is a 1772 broadside that gives us a really rare view into the interior of the Philadelphia shop. It lists some of the many European and West Indian goods that are on sale. You can see the rum, the tea, the spices, the gunpowder. There's a sign of the ongoing consumer revolution that is being linked to international trade. This is a piece of china made in England and exported to New England that celebrates the coronation of James II in 1685. This is an example of the growing colonial demand for English consumer goods. The Atlantic Ocean was not really so much a barrier during this time period as it was a highway. It linked communities and economies within and between the empires. Sugar, tobacco, other products of the Americas were marketed in Europe. London bankers financed the slave trade between Africa and the Portuguese Brazil. And Spain spent its gold and silver importing goods from other countries. As trade expanded, the British colonies in America became major overseas market for British manufactured goods. In turn, North Americans shipped farm products to Britain and the West Indies. They imported slaves and rum from Africa and the West Indies and exported fish and grains to southern Europe. And New Englanders built 1/3 of the ships in Great Britain's trading fleets. American colonists benefited from membership in the British Empire. Most did not complain about British regulation of their trade because of commerce and because business enriched the colonies, and lax enforcement of the Navigation Acts allowed smuggling. Besides, Britain's powerful Royal Navy protected the American ships. Despite significant differences, British America in many ways became closer and more similar to English colonies. Now, in this last section, we're going to be looking at the social class in the colonies and how patterns of class and gender and role changed in 18th century America. As colonial America matured, an elite emerged that was increasingly dominated politics and society. And although they were not as powerful as wealthy as English aristocracy, the gap between the rich and the poor probably grew faster in the 1700s than in any other period in American history. In New England, growing trade created a powerful merchant upper class, which often linked by family or business connection to London's great trading firms. There were no banks in America, so success often depended on credit to be had from personal connections back to London. By 1750, colonies in the Chesapeake and lower South were dominated by slave plantations producing tobacco, rice, and other staple crops, and the enormously wealthy planters who owned them and ruled these colonial governments. Even though colonial America had no titled aristocracy or legally established social ranks like in Britain, men of families with growing land and commercial wealth came to control much of the colony's political, economic, and social life. In this period, the different colonies were more strongly connected to England than to each other. And in a process historians call Anglicanization, they soon came to see themselves as more English than American. Wealthy colonies began to imitate emerging British fashions and tastes in behavior, consumption, and even in architecture. We see in this picture, this is a portrait of Daniel, Peter, and Andrew Oliver. These are sons of wealthy Boston merchants. The prominent display of their delicate hands tell us that they are probably not people who have ever done any hard labor, and the artist very intentionally shows this. You can also see that they are looking clearly British in this picture, not American. This is a portrait of Elijah Boardman. He was a merchant in Connecticut. He's wearing the attire of a gentleman, resting his arm on a counting desk. We see bolts of cloth in the back that are visible, but he is emphasizing his learning, not his wealth, by posing with books. We see two plays of Shakespeare, Paradise Lost by John Milton, and the London Magazine, also prominently displayed in this picture. By far the wealthiest of the mainland colonies were South Carolina's planters. They spent most of their time in Charleston, which is the richest city in British North America. They lived as essentially colonial American aristocrats. They enjoyed theaters, literary societies, social events, and lavish lifestyles of imported luxury goods and uniformed house slaves. Compared to other colonies, wealth in South Carolina was highly concentrated. Colonial elites began to emulate what they saw as England's balanced and stable social order. Freedom for them was based on their power as superiors to rule over dependents, those without wealth or prominence, and they wanted to operate within this hierarchical society which differentiated by men with greater or lesser talent. Society is being held together by influence, linking patrons and those dependent upon them. Each place in the hierarchy carried certain responsibilities and was revealed in dress, manners, and possessions. Colonial elites prided themselves on their refinement, their manners, education, and cultural knowledge, and they favored leisure over manual labor. Freedom from labor defined them as gentlemen. Yet, at the same time, poverty increasingly became a part of colonial life in 18th century America. Fewer free colonial Americans were poor compared to Britain, where 1/4 to 1/2 of the people required public assistance. But slaves lived in impoverished conditions, and the number of poor without property grew, with diminishing land and the growth of wage labor. Better off colonists generally viewed the poor as lazy and responsible for their own poverty, and while rural communities and cities gave some assistance to their own, they prevented the unemployed and propertyless newcomers from getting any kind of help or assistance. You can see this picture of Carter's Grove. This is near Williamsburg, Virginia. This is a grand plantation mansion with large formal gardens, in very much imitation of English design on this property. Most free Americans were members of what we would call the middle ranks. They lived kind of between the extremes of the wealth and of poverty. The vast majority of these were small farm families. The wide distribution of land and the economic autonomy that went with it distinguished colonial America from Europe. About 2/3 of the free male population owned their own land, and while 3/5 of the English population owned no property at all. By the 1700s, colonial farm families viewed land ownership as kind of a right, the social precondition of freedom, and they strongly resented the efforts of Native Americans, great landlords, or colonial governments to limit access to land. Their dislike of personal dependence and their understanding of freedom as not relying on others for a livelihood grew deeply in British North America and to a great extent reflected social reality for many white colonists. The family is the center of economic life in the 18th century American household economy. Most work revolved around the home, and men, women, and children all contributed to the family's well-being. The small farmer's independence depended to a great degree on the work that his dependent wife and children could do at the home. While most farmers first focused on growing food to survive, as business expanded in the 18th century, more and more farmers also produced for the market. Women were constantly at work, raising children, working in the home by cleaning, cooking, sewing, and other activities, and also working in the fields. Women's work increased in the 18th century despite the introduction of new consumer goods that replaced items previously made at home. This is a picture of the overmantel, the Van Bergen overmantel. The opportunity to achieve economic independence was central to American colonists' idea of freedom. This section is part of a 7-foot long painting by John Heaton from around 1773. It's probably designed to hang above a wide fireplace in the home of Martin Van Bergen. He was a Dutch farmer in colonial New York. The house and farm buildings are in Dutch style. The painting really gives us a rare, at that time period, view of a prosperous colonial farm with its full granary and livestock. Native Americans and African American slaves, as well as workers who probably were indentured servants, are among the individuals depicted by the artist. This is a portrait of the Cheney family. It illustrates the high birth rate in America. Suggests how many years of a woman's life were spent bearing and raising children, out of necessity to help work the farm. By the mid-18th century, the area that would become the modern United States was remarkably diverse in its people, its culture, and its social organization. From the Pueblo villages of the Southwest to the tobacco plantations of the Chesapeake, small farms of New England, feudal-like land estates of the New York Hudson's Valley, and frontier fur trading outposts. While elites tied to imperial centers of power dominated the political and economic life for most colonies, large numbers of colonists enjoyed greater opportunities for freedom, such as the access to the vote, access to land ownership, the right to worship freely, and an escape from government persecution than they had in Europe. Free colonists probably enjoyed the highest per capita income in the world, and the colony's economic growth made for a high birth rate, long life expectancy, and expanding demand for consumer goods. Yet many colonists experienced the partial freedom of indentured servanthood or the complete absence of freedom as slaves, making freedom and hopes for freedom essential to the development of North American colonies.